September 1950, San Francisco. Morning fog drifts off the bay as streetcars climb the hills and shopkeepers raise their metal grates. The Golden Gate Bridge disappears and reappears in the mist. Nothing about the day looks unusual. A few miles offshore, a Navy vessel holds its position in open water. On board, a fine aerosol is prepared for release into the onshore wind. Not smoke, not chemical gas, but bacteria. The city does not know it, but within days, this cloud will drift across nearly every neighborhood in San Francisco. It would later become known as Operation Sea Spray. Its purpose was not to attack an enemy. Its purpose was to answer a question the military could not stop asking. How vulnerable was an American city to an attack no one could see coming? By 1950, the Soviet Union had tested its first atomic bomb. American troops were fighting in Korea. Military planners in Washington feared that the next attack on the United States might not come from bombers or missiles, but from the air itself. Biological weapons, they believed, could be released from a ship far offshore and carried inland on ocean wind, settling invisibly across a coastal city. But no one could say with confidence how far such a cloud would travel, how it would move through streets and buildings, or how many people it would reach. Rather than keep theorizing, the military decided to test it, using a real American city as the laboratory, and organisms its researchers believed at the time were harmless enough to use safely. San Francisco, with its dense population and exposed coastline, became the target. Beginning on September 20th, 1950, and continuing for a week, a Navy ship stationed off the coast released an aerosol containing two organisms, Serratia, marcescens, and Bacillus globigii. Serratia marcescens was chosen for a specific reason. Its colonies grew with a distinctive red pigment, making it easy to identify in a laboratory, a built-in tracer for an invisible cloud. Researchers at the time widely considered it harmless to healthy people. Bacillus globigii, a spore-forming bacterium, served a similar role as a simulant. Across San Francisco, monitoring teams quietly set up sampling equipment at more than 40 locations. As the cloud drifted inland, they collected readings day after day, mapping not streets, but movement, how far the bacteria travelled, how quickly, and in what concentration. Based on that data, the Army later estimated that nearly all of San Francisco's roughly 800,000 residents had inhaled thousands of the bacterial particles released that week. The average dose fell within a range that, had the substance been anthrax instead of a supposedly harmless tracer, would have been enough to cause infection. The experiment had answered its question. A biological aerosol released from a ship offshore could blanket an entire American city. While the ship logged its readings, the city carried on as usual. Commuters rode streetcars. Children walked to school. Patients checked into hospitals for routine procedures. None of them had been told that the air itself was part of a military test. There was no public notice, no warning, no chance to object. For the military, this was vulnerability data, sampling coordinates and dispersion rates. For the people below, it was simply another week in September. The organisms were believed to pose little danger to a healthy adult. But San Francisco was not populated only by healthy adults. It was a city of infants, elderly residents, hospital patients, and people with weakened immune systems, none of whom had been asked. On October 11th, 1950, roughly 2 weeks after the release ended, 11 patients checked into Stanford Hospital with a rare and serious kind of urinary tract infection, all linked to Serratia marcescens. The outbreak was so unusual that the hospital's physicians wrote it up for a medical journal. 10 of the 11 recovered. 1 did not. Edward Nevin, recovering from prostate surgery, developed an infection that spread into his bloodstream and settled in a heart valve. He died 3 weeks later. The timing raised an obvious question. Had the military's experiment reached inside the walls of Stanford Hospital? But the evidence complicates a simple answer. No other hospital in San Francisco reported a similar spike in Serratia infections that fall, and all 11 patients had developed their infections following medical procedures, a pattern that pointed toward the hospital itself, not the open air, as the likely source. When the Army was later questioned about it under oath, officials called any connection to their tests coincidental, citing that same pattern. The Nevin family was not convinced. In 1981, They sued the federal government, arguing the military bore responsibility for Edward Nevin's death. A lower court ruled against them, not because a connection was disproven, but because it could never be proven. The family appealed all the way to the Supreme Court, which declined to hear the case. More than 70 years later, the question remains exactly where the courts left it: plausible, disputed, and never resolved. For decades, none of this reached the public. Operation Sea Spray remained buried inside classified files, described in the clinical language of sampling data and dispersion rates. Then, in 1977, the US Senate's Subcommittee on Health and Scientific Research summoned Army officials to testify. Under questioning, the Army confirmed what it had never before admitted. Between 1949 and 1969, it had conducted open-air biological tests over American cities more than 200 times. Operation Sea Spray was one of them. The secret was revealed nearly 3 decades after it happened. Long after the residents who had breathed it in had any way of knowing. San Francisco, the hearings revealed, was never an isolated case. Of the Army's open-air tests, roughly 80 had used live organisms its researchers considered harmless. In 1966, military scientists released a similar bacterium inside the New York City subway system, dropping light bulbs filled with it onto the tracks in Midtown Manhattan stations. The organism travelled for miles through the tunnels, and an internal Army report later warned that a genuine pathogen, released the same way during rush hour, could sicken enormous numbers of commuters before anyone noticed. In 1965, a similar test at Washington's National Airport exposed more than 130 travellers to a bacterial simulant. Within 2 weeks, they had unknowingly carried it to 39 cities across 7 states. San Francisco's fog had hidden more than one ship on the water. It had hidden a program, one built on the belief that entire populations could be studied without their knowledge, in the name of national security. None of this happened because officials set out to harm anyone. Scientists chose Serratia marcescens specifically because they believed it was safe, since the goal was never to actually endanger the people of San Francisco. Cold War fears of biological attack were real, and the military believed the data justified the risk. But intent does not erase what happened. The people of San Francisco were never asked whether their city could be used as a testing ground. They were never told what they were breathing. And when illness appeared afterward, they had no way of connecting it to anything at all. The deeper question Operation Sea Spray leaves behind has little to do with bacteria and everything to do with consent. What a government owes the citizens it claims to protect, when it decides quietly to study them instead. Return to San Francisco. The streetcars still move. The fog still rolls into the bay. For the people below, it looked like another September week. Above them had been an experiment they never knew they were part of. Some of the Cold War's darkest secrets weren't buried in vaults. They were carried on an ordinary wind over a city that never knew to look up.